name is Christina Zan. You can call me Christina. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a second-year PhD student in the English department. My degree generally is in American 20th and 21st century American Lit. My focus areas are Southern literature and women's and gender studies. And this year, I'm one of the 2 ADs in the Writing Center with Beth. And this is my 3rd Writing Center I have been in. My first as an AD. I've been doing Writing Center work since my 3rd semester of undergrad, so I really love being in Writing Centers. And thesis statements is something that I have been working with for a long time, but something I am still personalizing and learning more about all the time. It's always a growing process. And I'm excited that our journeys kind of met here to talk about thesis statements today. I think that's all you need to know about me.
Cool. Well, I'm Beth, Elizabeth Dellinger, but you can call me Beth. And I am also the other assistant director of the Writing Center. And I'm a PhD student as well. I study contemporary poetry and also poetry that has to do with the environment. And I have worked in one other Writing Center before working in this one, where I worked as a tutor during my undergrad and master's degree at Virginia Tech. And so I'm very excited to be here now and get to help out as the assistant director and do things like this with all of you. So today we're going to be obviously talking about thesis statements, and what we'll be doing through this hour is we'll start out just talking about what a thesis statement is, giving you some key things you should be aware of as you're trying to get started with your draft of your thesis statement. And then we'll get more specific and look at the different parts of a thesis statement and think about how you can use looking at those parts more narrowly to help you revise a thesis statement that you've already written. And then lastly, we'll do some practice where we'll give you some examples, and you'll have the chance to actually try drafting a thesis statement. And at the very end, we'll have the chance for you to have questions, or if you have questions about your own thesis statement, we can talk about those too. So that is where we're going. So I think Christina is going to get us.
Sorry, I just realized that I was muted and talking like I was not muted. So like you do hate to see it. And I was so confident. But no, like Beth said, we're going to start with kind of looking at what a thesis statement is. And I mean, how do you answer what a thesis statement is? Because I think it functions in a lot of really wonderful ways. But in every way, it is kind of the beating heart of your paper. For many of you, even if this is like, if it's your first or second semester and you're in an English 101 or 102 class, you've probably already thought about like how and when you get to your thesis. But your thesis as a final piece, as something that is like totally like, this is my 100% exact thesis, it's not going to change, does not have to be the first thing you do. And I think that's often a common misconception. Your thesis starts with an observation, right? Because your thesis is the concise main idea of your paper that lets your readers know, lets your audience know, like, this is what I'm going to be arguing, this is what I'm going to be talking about. But before you get there, you have to find something that interests you. You're reading a short story or a book or an article or seeing something on the news, or you've been personally affected by something. You're like, you know what? I need to talk about this. Like, there is something here that I don't have all the answers to, but I want to find answers to. There is something vexing here and compelling. And those observations are the foundation for your paper as a whole, and specifically your thesis. But I think a lot of people get caught up and think that if my thesis isn't like 100% final, like I can't write the rest of my paper. No, you should have a good draft of your thesis that says what you're going to do, what you want to do, what argument you're making, so that you can follow and make. a organized and detailed essay, but your thesis is subject to change throughout your paper. So what you should know when you sit down to write your thesis, so you know what your paper is going to be about, and what you should know as you keep making that thesis more detailed to get to the thesis that you eventually want your audience to see at the end of your introduction. These are the things you should know about a thesis. It should present your argument. When your reader, when your audience reads your thesis, they should get a pretty good idea of what your work is saying, what it will say, what your paper is going to say by reading the thesis. Obviously, they won't know everything, but they should be able to understand, like, okay, this is what I am being set up for. If you think about your paper as kind of like a roadmap, your thesis often represents like the destination. You know, if you want to tell your friend to check out this really cool new restaurant, right? Like you just went to this new restaurant, it's like absolutely lit, the food is amazing. You're not going to just start giving them directions. You're not going to be like, hey, I want you to eat at this place. So listen, you're going to take a left out of campus. They're going to be like, but where am I going? Like, and why do you want me to eat there? Like, you can't just tell me some place is good and then start telling me how to get there. Right? You're going to sit down. You're going to be like, I went to this new restaurant. It's called insert restaurant name here. And this is why I think that you should eat here. And now let's start going over the directions. So often think about your thesis statement as a way to let your audience know where they're going and why they should go there before you start getting into the details. And the kind of final misconception I'm just gonna go over is that I feel like often people think that thesis statements are like one sentence. That's like a three-pronged sentence. And we often learn this in high school. Like I learned this in high school. Thesis statements can be one sentence. They can be three-pronged, but often they're not. A thesis statement does not mean one sentence. More often than not, strong theses have like 2 to 3 sentences. And you need that time and that space to be able to answer not just what you're talking about, but how you're going to talk about it and why it's important to talk about. So these are some ways you can ensure that you're doing that. These are essentially the main things a thesis should be and the main things that they should do. Hyunwook, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. My advisor said to me, American essays are thesis driven. What does thesis driven means? Can you explain the thesis driven means? What the thesis driven means?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. So since the thesis is the main idea of your essay, it is when someone says your essay is thesis driven, they're essentially saying like your paper is driven or is motivated by the same idea. Often I feel like sometimes in papers we start with our thesis and then we start walking away from our thesis. We may kind of forget our thesis throughout the paper. Like as we're writing, as we start bringing in new information, we may talk about why that information is important, but we forget to connect it back to the thesis, right? Your thesis is raising questions that you are going to be providing the answers to, and so you always want to make it clear how those answers relate to the thesis. And so when we say something is thesis driven, we mean your paper is following one central argument. Make sure to always let that argument lead and to always make it clear to your audience how everything connects to the main questions that you're answering. Does that make sense, Hyunwook and anyone else? Okay, awesome. Thank you for asking. That was a really great question. Thank you for asking. So I have kind of like 70 things here that I feel like a thesis often does. And for your, how Hyunwook mentioned, something being thesis driven, if something's going to be driving your paper, you want it to be successful. so here are some ways, kind of like a little checklist to make sure that it is going to be successful. Make sure it is specific. You don't want to make generalizations or to leave a lot of room for people to poke holes in, or for them to people to relate it to multiple different ideas. You want it to be about one specific topic, one specific audience. Who am I writing to? What exactly am I writing about? Am I writing about, if I'm writing about, marijuana usage, am I writing about anyone who uses it, those who are using it for medical purposes, youths who are using it? When I say like who should make a change, it's not people in general, right? Like, is it doctors who need to make a change? Is it law, like the government? It should be reasonable. Anything always exists within its unique constraints of there are existing boundaries, and sometimes you may want to push back against those boundaries, but you can't make an argument that seems to not exist. Maybe in like a literary text, if you're writing about like the yellow wallpaper, you probably couldn't make a paper that the whole time the wallpaper was actually red, because there's no textual evidence for that, and it's not related to what's happening in the text. It should require analysis, so it shouldn't be so short or so basically factual that someone would just be like, okay, yeah, I agree. Or that you're able to prove your point in just a few words. It should answer the kind of so what question. People shouldn't, when people read your thesis, they should care. They should know that what you're writing about is important, and that goes into making sure you have the why and not just the what. It should indicate your main points and gesture towards your evidence. And what I mean by that is that your thesis is not like totally separate from like the paper. When something is thesis driven, like I said, you're continually connecting back. So your thesis should indicate to your audience the main points. If you're going to be talking about like analyzing a certain color or repetitive language in a text, if you're going to be looking at laws that are problematic surrounding the healthcare, don't just leave us with a general idea that we're talking about this big, very large subject in general. What should your audience expect in your essay? And then finally, it needs to be debatable. And I put this last because if your thesis isn't debatable, you don't really have a thesis. You don't really have a paper, because papers of fact don't really exist anymore unless you're in like the science field and you're discovering something brand new. It's rare that you will have something just factual. You are always making an argument. You're always proving your point, and your thesis is what the root, the foundation, the hook of that argument. And so if it's not debatable, everything falls apart very quickly because there's nothing to return to if you haven't brought up a question.
Yeah, so like Christina was saying, it's really important that your thesis is debatable because you are hopefully writing a paper that enters into a discussion on a topic. And so what you're saying is hopefully something that other people can also respond to. And that won't work if your thesis isn't debatable. So as you're starting to try and write your thesis, you may find yourself thinking, well, how do I make sure that my thesis is debatable? And here's 3 questions that you can think about as you're trying to make sure of that. Does it seek to convince readers to think or do something? So in other words, is it asking people to change their minds or to take action in some way? And we'll look at this example in a moment and see each of these questions in practice. The second one is, does it address a problem with no easy solution or absolute answer? If it's a problem that everyone already agrees on the answer to, or there's one solution that's really pretty obvious to everyone, no matter where they stand on most issues, then that's probably not going to be debatable because everyone already agrees. So it needs to be at least something that is complicated enough and doesn't have just one answer already, that you can give some perspective that will be unique and that other people can interact with. And lastly, does it take a position on which readers might realistically have different perspectives? So that's kind of related to the previous question. But if readers can't realistically have some different opinions on that position that you're taking, then probably it's not debatable. So to look at this example, I'll just read it quickly, and then we'll think about how it relates to these three questions. So this is an example from the Everyday Writer. And just as a side note, if you're looking for an example of a research essay, if you're in a English 102 class or another class where you need to write a research essay, there is an example, I think more than one example, in fact, in the Everyday Writer. And so you could look up this whole essay and look at it, but this is, of course, just the thesis statement. So to accelerate the move to sustainability, for-profit businesses need to learn from the hybrid model of social entrepreneurship to ensure that the company is efficient and profitable while still working for social change. And more investors need to support companies with long-term revolutionary visions for improving the world. So we want to think about these three questions in terms of this example. Does it seek to convince readers to think or do something? Well, yes, because it's asking readers to think about businesses and for-profit companies in a different way, and maybe think about how they should take a different tactic. So it's both asking readers to think differently, and it's asking some of these other groups of people to maybe even act differently, businesses and investors. So the second question, does it address a problem with no easy solution or absolute answer? Well, so just from this thesis, not having the background of the whole introduction, we can assume that the problem that it's approaching is how can businesses and corporations move towards sustainability? And that's a pretty complex problem. You could imagine that there could be a lot of possible solutions that people might propose. So there's definitely not just one absolute answer. So the answer to that question would be yes as well. And lastly, does it take a position on which readers might realistically have different perspectives? And this gives one possible idea in relation to that problem, but some people might think of completely different ways or different methods that businesses could take to try to move towards sustainability. And so, yeah, there could be lots of different perspectives on this issue. So this thesis would pass the test and would count as debatable. So you can use those questions yourself as you're trying to think through your own thesis.
So Beth just gave us a really great example of what a good thesis might look like, and we'll keep talking about that. But you can't talk about good without bad and bad without good. So now I often feel like bad feels a little extreme. A bad thesis is really just a thesis that needs a little help, and that's okay, because everything, even your thesis, is on a journey. But these are some things that can weaken your really cool ideas, because ideas are very rarely bad. I think ideas are often, if not always, really awesome, but they can be weakened if they have certain elements in them that dilute or do not best represent the ideas that you have. So the first one is something that often is seen either in thesis statements or at the very beginning of a paper, and we call it cosmic wind-up, which is a fancy way to say like forever. You know, when you start a paper and you're like, if you're talking about what, like feminism, it's easy to say like since the beginning of time women have struggled with like their body image, or since the beginning of time, like for hundreds and hundreds of years, like women have been fighting for equal rights. It's easy to say that, because it might not necessarily be wrong, right? Like for hundreds of years women have been fighting for equal rights, but it is vague and does not give specifics that ground your argument, and some of them may actually be incorrect. Like don't know, right, if something has happened since the beginning of time or not. And even if it has, your paper will never reasonably cover everything from the beginning of time. You're going to be looking, just like how you're looking at a specific audience and a specific argument and specific elements of that argument, you're also looking at a specific time frame. You're looking for something that's happening often now that's been influenced by events in the past, or you're talking about a specific, story that is influenced by a specific moment as well. Along the same line, often I feel like when people talk about their audiences, they'll make these large sweeping generalizations like everybody in the world struggles with their health. Like, everyone in the world struggles with their eating habits. And a lot of people probably do. Like, it may be everyone, but you never know if it is, right? Like, you have not interviewed every single person. You don't know that everyone does. And again, you're not appealing correctly or adequately to a specific audience. You want someone to see themselves in your paper, and you want to tailor your paper to a specific audience. If you say that no one ever does anything or everyone does something, you're not giving your audience a chance to know specifically what you're referring to. You could be hurting your paper in the long run by not having something to hold on to, and you're not actually appealing well to a specific audience. Observation and statement of fact is very similar, again, to what we've been kind of saying on the past couple slides, that if you just make a statement of fact or you just make an observation, that's your starting point. It's not your whole argument. Like, you want to make a debatable statement, several debatable statements. You want to be raising questions that you will then answer. Now, of course, fact is going to be throughout your paper. You need facts and statistics and evidence to support your thesis, but facts don't support facts. Facts support arguments. And observations are where you start. You start by making observations, like I said at the beginning, about a text or an issue, and then you put that observation into a thesis to discuss and argue about an observation as the foundation, but you never want to leave it at that first step. Summary, some people will try to force a lot of background info into their thesis statement. And I mean, this isn't a discussion of how much summary should be in a paper or not. That could be a different discussion. An introduction will often have some level of summary to it. But if your introduction or if your thesis has too much summary in the intro or any summary in the thesis, it takes away, it detracts from your argument, because your audience is getting so bogged down on you giving them information about an issue and information about a text that they don't actually get a chance to see your argument. They're just seeing information. Information should come later, contextually in the moment that you need it to support your thesis, not within the thesis itself. And introducing more than one topic. Now, you may be looking at more than one subtopic within like a general topic. Like if you're talking about like opioid addiction, you may be interested in like a couple of different audiences, like looking at athletes and then people with like chronic illnesses. You may be looking at those two sides of the same coin and like comparing how those situations are both problematic but different. But you don't want to talk about like addiction in general. You don't want to be like, I'm going to talk about opioid addiction, and I'm also going to talk about marijuana, and I'm going to talk about like gateway drugs, because then it just gets messy. And that's part of deciding an argument, but also introducing something in your thesis. And don't introduce something in your thesis if you're not going to be using it in your paper. Everything in your thesis should be the foundation for something in your paper. And here are some tips and tricks if you're like, that kind of makes sense, but like I don't know totally how to spot that. Well, I got you. If you read a thesis statement, like read it out loud, try to put your bias aside of like you wanting to think it's a good thesis, because as human beings, we naturally, I think, a lot want our writing to be good, but try to be unbiased, pretend you're reading it for the first time. And this kind of goes back to debatability. If you can imagine someone being like, yeah, duh, like no shit, you know what I mean? You probably need to that's probably too factual. You probably need to look at some of the tips that Beth discussed 2 slides ago on how to make it more debatable. I like the yeah, obviously trick, because I think it's funny. When you read something, you're like, yeah, no shit, yeah, totally. That makes sense. That's you. Like nothing else to say. You shut down an argument before you've been able to start it at that point. And in that case, the solution would be like, you might need to reframe your topic, add more detail. And again, you can look back into the details from the 2 slides ago, when Beth went into some more details on reframing and adding detail and adding elements to the fact, because it may not mean you have a bad topic at all. It may just mean that like you're looking at the entry point for an argument and not the argument itself. So, if you just say Edgar Allan's poem, The Raven, makes people afraid, most people would be like, yeah, duh. It's creepy. Like, that's the point. Like, it's supposed to be. But maybe you want to emphasize that there's like a certain kind of fear in there. Like, it's not just general fear. Like, what is it that makes people afraid? So maybe like the repetition and the imagery in the poem makes people remember and be aware of loss. And Edgar Allan Poe's goal with the poem is not just to scare people, but is a rumination on loss. And that loss is what causes fear, because we want to look away. We don't want to have to look at it. But the raven itself forces the speaker to look when they might not want to. And that's a way to add detail to something that is more or less factual. And you can see that in the next 2 as well. Like, people need to wear masks because there's a citywide mandate. That's factual. If there's a mandate and you're not doing it, you're breaking the law, right? So, but as we've seen, like there's a lot of pushback often on masks. There's different, there are anti-maskers, and like, I'm not here to like support that movement, but as an immunocompromised human being. So, but either way, like there are people who are pushing back against that, even if they shouldn't be. So you would want to add more detail. Again, with like the drug addiction is bad and we need to stop it. You're not going to have someone come up and be like, hi, yeah, so like I think drug addiction is good and I'd like it to keep going. Like if that person says that, they need some help. So you instead, but drug addiction is something that needs to be talked about. So you could specifically, again, say like opioid addiction is an like under-discussed issue in our society today because doctors resort to an extreme painkiller before other methods, and it becomes a gateway to long-term addiction that is easily avoidable. And thus, doctors need to come up with alternative methods or better education about opioids and alternative meds in order to limit the spread of this addiction. And you can kind of see how that, again, it adds the claim to it. Like Beth was saying, it makes it clear that you have a claim and you have some reasoning, like you have some rationale.
So we've talked about what a thesis statement is and giving you some ideas about what a thesis statement should do or should not do. And now we're going to zoom in farther and look at the parts of a thesis statement and how you actually put one together. And the two parts that we'll talk about are the claim, which is, it can include like the detail or observation from either the text that you're looking at or from your research that kind of is the foundation that inspired your thesis statement. And but the claim should definitely include the concept or kind of the conclusion, the argument that you've come to and that you're going to explain through the rest of your paper. So it's a short statement of that conclusion that you're trying to help other people understand. And then the second part of a thesis statement is the reasoning, which is where you've made this claim and you're going to add more detail. Just like Christina was talking about, you're adding more to your claim to give your reader an idea of why this matters, and also to give your reader an idea more clearly of where you're going to go as you explain your claim in the paper.
So this is my little magic thesis template. I'm gonna give some credit to my friend Andy Waddell. She's also a PhD student. I don't know if any of you are in her, have taken one of her English 101 or 1 or 2 classes, but I have adapted this from something she brought up like 2 years ago. And the reason why I call it a magic thesis template is not because it is like the end all be all. Like if you plug this stuff in, like your thesis is done, but that is kind of a surefire way to visualize a thesis and have a draft of a thesis without kind of floundering and having no idea how to put your ideas together. And that feels kind of magical to me because I know personally, I don't know if anyone else struggles with this, things are moving in my head and I cannot get them to get on the paper in front of me. And like, I really struggle sometimes to actually visualize on paper what's going on in my head. And I find the process of finally getting that on paper and being able to see it for the first time a really magical experience. So that is kind of my goal with this template always when I share it with students or with friends is start here. Give yourself a place to start. Give yourself something to visualize. Give yourself something that you know you can see your claim, you can see your reasoning, your observation is clear, and you know you have all the elements you need, and now you have the foundation for going through and giving in more detail and tweaking your claim and putting it in your own voice. But essentially what I like to do is add observation to claim to reasoning. So observation is not necessarily an element of a thesis statement, like claim and reasoning are the elements of a thesis statement, like Beth just said. But like I was saying earlier, the observation is the foundation for your essay. So throughout your introduction, you will be making it clear what your foundation is, what your observation is. And depending on how much detail you give throughout your intro, you may need less observation in your thesis, or you may need some more. It just, again, it always depends on like how much detail you've given in your intro so far. But you always want to make sure that within your thesis, within the claim and the reasoning, those 3 things that I said earlier are clear. The what, like the what are we talking about? The why are we talking about this? And the how will we talk about this? And so I find that this kind of like knocks those 3 out. And this is my favorite way to put these 3 things into order for an initial visualization. Is by looking at observation, we can see claim. This is important because reasoning. And again, your observation is, by looking at your topic, your specific topic, we can see your argument, and then this is why this argument matters. Like, this is why you should keep reading this paper. This is the so what that I mentioned earlier. So you're both being able to refer to the so what, and to make sure no one says like, yeah, no, duh, we get it. This is kind of like your way to get around that. So I don't know why I keep using drug examples today, but I think I see this. I feel like as a 102 teacher, I find that people talk about things like opiates and marijuana often. So it feels like an area that many people are passionate about. So this is me using this template to make something. So I've said, by observing the way many people prescribed opiates suffer devastating side effects and often become addicted to prescription drugs, we can see that action must be taken in order to save the lives of American men and women. This is pertinent because without proper intervention and successful alternatives, families across the United States will continue to lose their loved ones. So you can see a lot of good things here right off the bat. We see the specifics. We see that the issue with devastating side effects and becoming addicted to prescription drugs is our observation. And we can see the claim that, like, we got to do something about this because people are dying. And we can also see why this is relevant. We have like some pathos here. We're appealing to emotions by discussing loved ones that can be lost. And it's a way to say, like, oh my gosh, like, these are my ideas, like, right here. I'm looking at them. And still there's room for improvement, you know, like, I've used, you know, people and we, and those could be more specific, right? Like, who is we? Who are the people? The language feels formulaic. It doesn't feel supernatural to say, like, you know, by observing the way, and like, period, like, this is important because. That doesn't feel supernatural. It feels a little robotic. It feels formulaic because we're using a formula. And that's why I see this as like the first step. I feel like once you can visualize your ideas together, then you can go into understanding more about what a claim and what reasoning is, what your claim is, what your reasoning is, and you can make this sound even more personal and even more specific.
So like Christina is saying, once you've drafted that foundational draft of the thesis statement, you can go into it and keep revising it and making it stronger and more detailed. And so we're going to go through the different parts, the claim and then the reasoning, and look at a few ideas for how you might be able to make it stronger or make it more specific. And so the first tip is to think about who is involved in the situation and to be more specific about that in your thesis statement itself. So again, here's another example, and I'll read this one as well. This first part of the example down at the bottom of the slide where it says the same problem applies to teachers of the entire nation. That's actually the part that Christina was talking about, that is the observation that this thesis statement is built on. And if we had seen the whole introduction here instead of just the thesis statement, we would see that the author of this paper is talking about teacher strikes and how that shows us that teachers should be paid more. And so this author actually made their thesis statement more detailed by not including that observation in the thesis statement itself, but actually using the whole introduction to set up the context for the thesis statement, which is a great move you can make as well. But looking past that, when this thesis statement says, more specifically, the Department of Education should work towards an effective teacher pay method. That's the claim right there. And then the rest of the sentence is the reasoning, which we'll look at in a little bit. But you can see in the claim, the author gets really specific about who is involved. The Department of Education should work toward an effective teacher pay method. That's a lot more clear, more debatable, and more specific than if the author had just said, schools should pay teachers more, or teachers should be paid more. Saying the Department of Education really helps to communicate clearly and make an arguable thesis statement. Another tip for thinking about how to revise your claim is to look at the other part. So if you have usually some person or entity or organization or department of the government even that is the main actor in the situation, you've also got the rest of your claim. And so you can think about, what is that new action or idea that you're trying to argue for your readers to understand, and try to get as specific as you can about that. So in that example, rather than just saying teachers should be paid more, you can tell the author has done some research about what it looks like and they're able to actually use the phrasing an effective teacher pay method. And so that lets me know, okay, they know something about how the Department of Education works. And so that's much more specific and effective than just making a really general statement. And the same thing is true from that previous example that we had looked at. Rather than just saying something like businesses need to become more sustainable, the author gets specific and says, here's this exact idea for what I think needs to happen in order for businesses to be sustainable. They need to learn from the hybrid model of social entrepreneurship. And so again, much more effective than just making a really general statement. So first, zoom in on your claim, see how you can make it more specific by looking at who's involved and by looking at what action or understanding you're arguing for. And then take a look at the second part of the thesis statement, which is your reasoning. So here, the reasoning is the part of the statement that says that it ensures teachers can live sustainably, provide optimal education to their students, and in turn improve the US education system. So you can see that really answers the question of why does this matter? Because most people are going to think that it's probably a good idea for teachers to live sustainably and provide good education and for the US education system to be improved. So giving those details helps readers to know why this topic matters, and it also lets me as a reader know that as the author goes on through their essay, those are probably some of the points they're going to be talking about. And so I have kind of in my mind a roadmap for where the author is going. Sometimes authors go beyond just giving that kind of reasoning and roadmap and maybe even add another sentence. As you can see here, this is the same thesis, but there's another sentence following it that says the result of this reform is important for not only ensuring economic stability for teachers, but for preparing the future of America to make a positive influence within the modern day world. So your thesis doesn't have to just be one sentence. Often it's 2 or 3 sentences. And adding in a really clear statement about what the result of taking action or changing your way of thinking, or on the other hand, maybe the dangers of not taking action or not changing our ways of thinking, that can be another way to make your thesis even more impactful and a clearer argument that shows exactly what it is that makes this issue so important for you to talk about. And you can see this other example that we've looked at before doesn't have a statement at the end that says something clearly like the result of this would be, but instead it's kind of embedded in the thesis itself. As you look at it closely, it talks about companies being efficient and profitable while still working for social change. Well, most companies need to be efficient and profitable, so that's pretty important. And then it even ends with this phrase about supporting companies with long-term revolutionary visions for improving the world. So even just by ending the thesis statement with that phrase about improving the world, it leaves me as a reader with a general idea of why this matters and what you're aiming for, or what the author is aiming for in making this argument. One other thing to keep in mind after you've spent some time looking closely at your claim, looking closely at your reasoning, is to just take a step back and look at your thesis statement as a whole and think about what sorts of assumptions might lie behind different parts of your thesis statement and how readers could potentially disagree or have questions about those assumptions. And that is really helpful to you as a writer because it actually opens up possible avenues for you as you think about what sort of questions you might want to consider from possible readers. So if I were trying to do that with this example, I would take it apart piece by piece and say, okay, the Department of Education should work toward an effective teacher pay method. Well, what assumptions are embedded in that beginning statement? Well, the big one that I see there is that the Department of Education is the who that should take action. And maybe some people would argue that it shouldn't be action on a national level. It should be on a state level or more of a local level to make sure teachers are paid well. And so that would give me the opportunity to think about whether that's something I'm okay with agreeing or with assuming that my audience would already agree with, or whether it's something that I might have already addressed in my paper and already argued for, and so it's not a problem, or whether it's something, on the other hand, that I might want to go in and add some things to my paper to make sure that I'm not just making an assumption. And so it gives me the opportunity to think through those questions. The same thing would happen if I went further and thought about, okay, what about this part where it says where teachers, so that teachers can live sustainably, provide optimal education to their students, and in turn improve the US education system. That's phrased kind of like a set of actions that follow each other. If teachers can live sustainably, then they can provide better education, and then the whole system will be better. Are there any points in those connections that people might disagree with? Like, might some people disagree with the idea that teachers being paid more would be the best way to improve the US education system? And so trying to, like before, trying to think about those assumptions that maybe someone might disagree with gives me some ideas for what I might need to cover in my paper, or I can decide most readers would agree with that and decide it's not important, but it's important for me to have thought through if I'm trying to write a thesis statement that will guide my whole paper.
So now that we've kind of gone over what our thesis statements are, what they do, how to spot good and bad ones, how to improve them, how to draft ones, and how to kind of slowly master the different elements of a thesis, we're gonna spend just a couple minutes with you so that you get the chance to make your own thesis. So we have two of these, and I'll do the first one. One's kind of more literary based, like doing a close reading argument of a short story or a poem or whatnot. This is a short story. And our next one is more retcon based. So what we're going to do on both slides is give you some information about a topic. For me, I'll be giving information about a short story. And then I'm going to list a lot of elements that are relevant to the story, but may or may not be relevant to your specific argument. And what I would like for you all to do is, after I read it, I'm going to take like 2 minutes for you all to draft your own thesis, and then see if anyone is willing to share. So this is a short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It follows a woman, Jane, who chronicles her thoughts about her husband, who is a doctor, who keeps her restrained within her home due to a diagnosed, but unknown to the reader, mental or physical illness. Jane slowly becomes obsessed with wallpaper in her room, beginning to see women moving in the walls as well. And in the end, Jane kind of gives herself over to these beliefs in the wallpaper. And the audience is left to decide whether Jane was crazy the whole time or sane, and whether her kind of giving herself over to her potential delusions is a victory or a defeat or both. So some elements in the story that may or may not be useful to you are that Jane is a woman. She has just had a baby. Her husband is a male and he is a physician. The place Jane is restrained within is a house, and as it gets more limited, it becomes the bedroom. The wallpaper is yellow. The figure contained inside of it is a woman and then women. John, the husband, refuses to let Jane write. The story was written in 1890 and released in 1892 by a woman, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Jane believes she has released and then become the woman from the wallpaper at the end of the story. It is told from Jane's perspective in the first person, almost as if she is writing to us. Jane does not believe her husband understands her, and her condition worsens throughout the story. So it's 2:22. Let's just take 1 minute. We'll take till 2:23, and we can draft what the beginning of a thesis might be. And then if anyone is willing to share, we can look at those together. So just 1 minute. Okay, so it's been exactly a minute. Does anyone want to share? You don't have to use your mic unless like you're really passionate about using your mic. You can use the chat. Does anyone want to share what they've drafted so far? Does anyone want to share like what topic or what observation they found? I gave kind of like that list of observations. Does anyone want to say which one they found the most interesting? I promise if you share what you think is interesting, I won't ask you to share your thesis. I might give an example, but I'd like to give one based on what y'all care about. Awesome. Thank you, Quinn, for sharing. I really appreciate it. And it was on the abusive behavior of John, the husband. So yeah, absolutely. If there's some of these observations, like the fact that Jane's condition worsens through the treatment that her husband gives her as a doctor that he believes is actually, he says is helping her when clearly it's not. Jane does not believe that John understands her. John takes away some of her abilities, like her ability to write. So you could always make a thesis that says, you know, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman shows the consequences of what happens when a woman is trapped in an abusive relationship with her husband, that is in an emotionally abusive relationship with her husband, through the limits that John places on Jane, what he takes away from her, and the progression of her illness as he continues to restrain from her. The audience can see Gilman showing how negative emotional relationships can minimize someone's autonomy and freedom, especially a woman's. So thank you, Quinn, for kind of starting that one off. And I hope that that was helpful. Let's do one more real quick, and then we'll pretty much be done.
All right, so this is more of a research-based example, and it's about bicycling in the city of Columbia. And so, yeah, so the basic situation is bicycling can provide a sustainable and healthy method of transportation, but many residents of Columbia have concerns about safety, and that may be one reason they don't try bicycling to commute to work or school. And so here's a number of different facts and different perspectives about the issue. And so as I'm reading them, try to listen and think, okay, which one would be maybe, or which combination of facts and perspectives would be helpful to you as a foundation if you're trying to craft a thesis. So like as that observation that helps you to come to a conclusion. So 0.6% of Columbia commuters bike, which is the same as the average all across the United States. There are 23 miles of bike lanes in Columbia. In a poll about bicycling conducted by a local news source, residents mentioned safety concerns about traffic on major roads, drivers being unaware of laws related to driving around bicycles, and the lack of bike lanes. 31% of poll respondents said they would be willing to bike to work if their car disappeared tomorrow. Studies show an increase in cycling in a city can reduce traffic congestion, air pollution, and noise pollution, as well as reducing carbon emissions. One study found that a perceived increase in safety of 10% corresponded with an increase in cycling of over 10%. The League of American Bicyclists reported that Colombia has very good laws related to cycling and cyclist rights on the road, but less good biking infrastructure like bike lanes. And lastly, experts from the Town Bike Collective say Colombia is surprisingly bikeable, but major roads aren't safe, so cyclists have to learn to navigate the secondary roads, the smaller roads. Also, cyclists can't rely on public signs or lanes, like bike lanes or infrastructure, to help with safe navigation. And lastly, both drivers and cyclists do not always know bicycle-related traffic laws, and traffic laws are not always enforced. So that's a collection of information. So now's your chance. I'll give you a minute, like Christina did, to try to think through which pieces of information might be the observation that you could make a claim about. And maybe you'll get to the reasoning part, or maybe you won't, but see what you can do getting started in just 1 minute. So we will start now. All right, so that's 1 minute. Did anyone have any ideas for where they might start if they were making this from this information? Yeah. So commuters biking improves the quality of life in cities, but fears over safety reduce the amount of bikers on the road. Yeah, I definitely think I would start with something positive like that too. Yeah, and Danielle says, I first thought about the lack of accessibility and ease for bicyclists. Yeah, I think either of those would be a great way to start, because they help you move from making an observation into thinking about a claim. Probably going from talking about those fears or the lack of accessibility into making some kind of claim about what is needed as we move forward. And maybe that would be, we need more bike lanes, or we need more, we need to make drivers and bicyclists more aware of bicycle laws. So yeah, I think either of those ideas would be a great way to start. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. So just a few final tips. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no. Yeah, we'll just go through this one really quickly. Again, I started with a little bit of this. Your thesis is a living, breathing statement that's subject to change, just like you as a human being and a writer. So don't feel locked into your thesis. If you start writing and you realize that your argument is moving in a slightly different direction, that's okay. Just make sure your thesis does reflect your paper. Like, if you start moving in a different direction and your thesis doesn't reflect that, don't just leave the thesis. And at the same time, don't try to force your paper to fit into a thesis that no longer is helping you. And then and we'll go to the Q&A in just a second, but and then you can revise your thesis at any time. Just make sure that they're always working in tandem. And then again, like I said, and now I got a chance to answer this because Hyun Wook answered this asked this kind of at the very beginning, but papers are thesis driven. So always make sure that each paragraph and each point that you bring up is supporting your thesis statement, your final thesis, and that is connecting back and forth. And if you need any more help, you can see our tutors at the Writing Center anytime. Beth and I tutor 5 hours a week. Pretty much the rest of our tutors tutor 10 hours a week. We're totally online this semester, but you can make face-to-face synchronous online appointments and asynchronous appointments where you upload a paper and get feedback. And we would love to help you on your theses and your essays and make sure that your thesis is doing what it needs to. And of course, you can utilize your resources you have every day, like the Everyday Writer that Beth gave some examples for earlier. And I think we're just going to kind of jump into the Q&A, and Beth may give a couple places where in the Everyday Writer that are helpful. And if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. You can use your mic. If you have to go, you can totally go ahead and go. We love having you here. But if you have questions, please stay, and we will stay as long as it takes to answer your questions.